Hello and welcome back to the Today live session right here on TikTok and Instagram. And if you're just joining us, you know that we are also having a live audience right here at NTU's Wee Kim Wee School of Communication and Information. Our live audience joining us here in the studio. Thank you for sticking around. I'm Elizabeth Neo, your host this afternoon. Now, this is part 2 in our 4-part webinar series where we'll be looking at some of the findings from today's youth survey. And I've also got more prizes to give away at this session. All you have to do is stick to the end of the session. I'll reveal a question at the end, and all you have to do is just be the first 5 to direct messages with the correct answer, and we will be in touch with you for that $50 Grab Food voucher. We also open to the floor to questions and comments, and also taking them live on our TikTok and Instagram as well. So send them through. If you have any questions for specific guests, let us know. Now, today we're talking about should we agree to disagree when it comes to LGBTQ issues. And joining me to unpack that discussion, I have Nabila Awang. She is a senior journalist at Today, and she's written articles on this topic. Imran Taib is a director of the Dialogue Center. Imran, hi. Clement, he is a spokesperson for Pink Dot. And Chang Do-Chen, assistant pastor at 316 Church. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now, without further ado, I'm going to start because I know everybody's really excited. I want to draw up some survey results from our Today Youth Survey. Now, close to 7 in 10 youths agree that the repeal of 377A represents a step towards a more inclusive society. And then when it comes to same-sex marriage, youths are divided on their views. So about 37% agree and strongly agree, 31% neither, 33% disagree and strongly disagree. So this is when it comes to same-sex marriage, youths are divided. On whether it is important to uphold and safeguard the definition of marriage, this is what they say. 62% agree and strongly agree, and about 12% disagree and strongly disagree. This is when it's on whether it is important to uphold and safeguard the definition of marriage. So I'd like to open this conversation by asking you, does the repeal of 377A represent a step towards a more inclusive society?
Yeah, sure, I'll go first. I'll talk about repeal. It's obviously something that not only just people in the LGBTQ community are happy about. I think collectively as a whole, all Singaporeans can agree that this is a step forward in the right direction. I think however you look at it, it's progress. Very clearly, the previous compromise, if you could even call it that was struck by the government, doesn't really seem to be satisfying people anymore. I think Singaporeans have made their views heard. And I'm very happy to hear that the youths agree. So overwhelmingly, and I'm glad that the government has finally taken that step in the right direction.
Yeah, so in some ways, there is obviously a diversity of opinion on this subject of the repeal of 377A. Whilst there are those who celebrate this as a step forward, and they have been persuaded in that sense because they view this law as discriminatory and so on. There are others also who are aware that this law is one of those steps that has preserved other things from being challenged. So some of the diversity of opinion that I've come across in society is because the ones who are more sanguine about the repeal of 377A are aware that there are other consequences from the repeal of 377A that they've observed in other countries. So the other countries that have repealed the equivalent of 377A have gone on, for example, to debate and then to promote and then to legalize, for example, same-sex marriage, the adoption of children by same-sex couples and so on and so on. So these are other things that some parts of society are aware that these are part of what 377A has kept from the forefront before, and therefore the repeal has then opened up these other areas.
I think if you look at Singapore society in the past, I mean, we get our independence in 1965. So it's also a nation in the making, where a lot of our views are tied to our communal interests and communal ideas, whether it's race, religion, or our affiliations. So what I would say is that the survey result does show an evolution of our thinking as a nation state that is deeply diverse, as well as the secular basis of the state. It may not change the views, the individual views of people, whether they think homosexuality is right or wrong, but what has been apparent is the idea that we need to be more inclusive as a society that is deeply diverse and to have a secular basis in decisions and policy making. And I will say that this is a result of the civic education that has been evolving since our independence stage. That is why you see the survey results show that the repeal of 377A has got to do with the younger generation's ideas or values on inclusivity and non-discrimination. But when it comes to same-sex marriage, it's still divided. Probably there are those who think along the line that same-sex marriage is just another consequence of this idea of inclusivity and non-discrimination. But there are others who might still hold on to their deeply held religious beliefs. And that's where I think the differences are stuck in the second survey question.
Yeah, so bring back to that point on youths being divided, I just want to bring up that statistic again. So it was a fair 30-30-30. Why do you think, they are divided on this issue of same-sex marriage?
I think, just jump in here. I think different people have different definition of what inclusivity means. So perhaps, when in August, when they were debating, they talk about the repeal, a lot of public discussion moved from giving LGBTQ basic human rights, decriminalizing gay sex, to things like forming the definition of marriage for Singaporeans. So I feel like perhaps for some people the term inclusivity means not having same-sex marriage, perhaps allowing for people in gay relationships to also get married. But perhaps for some other people also inclusivity means essentially just having basic human rights for every citizen of Singapore. Yeah.
So then actually what does this all mean? Because what does this all mean for you? They have moved to repeal 377A. At the same time, the government has moved to protect the definition of marriage, which is that it's between one man and one woman. At the end of the day, what does this mean for your communities?
Sure, maybe I'll just quickly, because I think my friend Tochen touched on that already. A lot of the conversation about repeal and since the announcement also has been made at the National Day rally has centered not only just on repeal, but what else the government is going to do to, as you guys have explained, protect the definition of marriage. What they have not decided to do is to enshrine the definition of marriage into the Constitution, which I think is a good thing. Singapore is a secular country, as the Constitution is not the canvas for which we should be enshrining any sort of religious values into it. Singapore is a place for all, people of creeds, colors, faiths, and races. I think an important thing to note also here is that when the government, struck this bargain, it is effectively telling Singaporeans to say, we've reached a consensus on repeal. We've reached a consensus on the decriminalization of gay sex. On the topic of marriage, it's not as if LGBTQ groups really have been campaigning very strongly for marriage equality to begin with. Historically, it's actually never really been the center of any campaign. This is a conversation that Singaporeans need to continue to have so that we can reach a consensus or an agreement of what that looks like. So the topic of inclusivity, what that means for Singaporeans, I think that's still an evolving process, which is why when I look at the statistic again, I think you see that youths are divided. I actually see it as youths are undecided. I see this as an opportunity for people to, with full facts, with a full understanding of the lived experiences of the people here, with full empathy on multiple sides of this issue, on how and why people believe the way they do, we can reach some sort of common ground and a way forward. I don't think we can look at this and form any sort of conclusion about what is to come.
Well, you see, this is the one of the elements, of this discussion at a national level. Whilst on the one hand, the youths in your survey have responded on, in some ways, celebrating the repeal of 377A, but they've also responded when asked very specifically on the question of should same-sex marriage be legalized. Is that this third question that was asked on a survey? They've been very clear about their response to a clear question. Now, we should bear in mind that it's the same youth that's responding to the same survey. So just now, obviously we were discussing different parts of society having diverse opinions and so on. But it's very interesting that the same youth, when asked these two questions, are responding in a very different way. Now, if we accept that the youth who have been responding in celebrating same-sex marriage, in celebrating the repeal of 377A, they're well-informed, they are highly empathetical, they have done the homework, done the research, then it would also be the case that they are well-informed, highly empathetical, and they've done the homework and research on the subject of same-sex marriage, but they're responding in a very different way. And the youth that you have been asking for this survey result, I suspect are not religious groups, so to characterize this thing being confined or being driven by religious groups is maybe an exaggeration. So I'd say if this group is representative of society, there is the element of being persuaded that 377A is in the language of some activists discriminatory and therefore should be repealed. They've been convinced about that, but they also at the same time, having done their own homework, have decided that same-sex marriage should not be promoted or should not be legislated for. Why? Because maybe they understand that there is merit in keeping marriage definition the way it is. They understand that the definition of marriage is not just about the activity between two persons. I suspect that they are not coming to an opinion and imposing that opinion on the activity between two persons, which is why they celebrate the repeal of 377A, but because they understand that the definition of marriage has wider implications beyond the relationship between two persons. It's got implications on, whether it's HDB housing or whether it's in, child adoption and other such things. So if we accept that youths are well informed and they have done the homework and research, then we should also accept that they understand what they're responding to, especially when the question is very clear. Yeah.
So maybe I do agree that there are wider implications to the discussion of marriage. I agree. The youths also have done their research. I think actually we all have too. So maybe I can ask you, what are the wider implications of marriage? I don't think it's uncontroversial for me to say as a gay person that I would like to have marriage or the option to have marriage one day, and the wider implications that you and I are talking about are everything not just from legitimizing my relationship in the eyes of the law, but you're right, it includes housing, it includes certain benefits, access to healthcare, insurance. I don't think it's controversial to say that gay people in Singapore should have that too. So, I mean, yeah, what's wrong with that?
No one disagrees that gay people should be denied access to healthcare, or and so on. But the way marriage is defined right now, and the other legislation that revolves around marriage, there's priority housing in HDB for married couples and so on, and there's good reason for that. From the time of inception of that particular incentive, Singapore as a nation has been experiencing a declining birth rate. So there is social merit, social value in making it easier for parents to raise kids and so on and so on.
But housing is not tied to parents. Housing is tied to relationships. There are heterosexual couples without kids that are able to access housing.
Okay,
sure,
guys, I want to take this chance to ask you from your experience. This is a question from our audience member. Do you think Singapore is a safe environment for LGBTQ people?
Well, maybe I can jump in over here. I think if you want to compare to other countries, I think you can say yes, relatively safe compared to other places where LGBTQ people face a lot more violence. But I will say that there's actually still a long way we have to go for full equality. I think repeal is a big step forward in that right direction. But I think I have to acknowledge that it's not a done deal. And even just to get acceptance as human beings here in society at a social and cultural level, there's still a lot of strides that we have to make to fully embrace LGBTQ people throughout. I'm talking about acceptance at home. I'm talking about acceptance in schools. I'm talking about feeling included in the workplace. What we've really heard from LGBTQ groups after the wake of repeal announcement is that a lot of LGBTQ youths actually found themselves facing a lot of hostility.
Yeah.
And I can empathize with that. I was in JC in the 2007 parliamentary debates on repeal, and I really remember what the environment then was like. To have my belonging in this country, to have my dignity and humanity as a Singaporean be discussed and debated about whether it was okay for me to be in Singapore and for me to access full equality and rights as everyone else. That is actually very difficult to go through. And there has been a lot of people that have reached out to LGBTQ groups looking for help. So it depends on how you define safe. I think conversations around safety have broadened to beyond just physical safety, but to also mental health and stability.
Yeah. So these are obviously concerns that the community faces, even though so-called 377A is out of the way. Imran, perhaps I'd like to bring you into this conversation. How do we address these concerns then? Because at the policy level, some change has been made, but for people in the community, I think there are some issues like bullying, inclusivity, which maybe is, it's something that people in the community at that level need to address. How do we address that?
Yeah, I want to go back to Clement's point on safety. I think safety goes beyond just physical safety, which we are quite fortunate, and I agree with Clement, and in Singapore, we have the laws in place that will not tolerate incitement or calls for violence. But we need to expand the definition of safety to also include psychological safety, emotional safety, financial safety, and many other aspects that sometimes being from the heteronormative group feels that these are things that we don't have to worry too much about. And that also reminds me of my own privilege. And when I conduct dialogues and discussions, that's where I was being challenged by some of the stories on the ground that emerged of how many of these taken for granted notions of safety are not really present within the LGBTQ community. And that actually explains the high degree of mental health issues amongst the LGBTQ community. In my own community, it's very, very difficult to get voices from the LGBT community to be really out and to be on stage here, for example, and say, I'm gay, and these are some of the issues that I'm facing. Because the notion of even coming out is not safe. I've heard many cases in these various safe spaces that I conducted. People telling their stories of being kicked out of the house, of being physically abused, of being called names, of losing their jobs. And I think these are aspects that needs to be addressed. And when we talk about having dialogues and conversations, all stories are valid, but not all stories are equal. Because some stories may harm others who are listening to it. For example, if I assert my right to say something, we also have to be mindful of how it creates an emotional response from the other person. And this is something that happens a lot in dialogue. And we have to be more mindful of the kind of things that we say, the kind of words that we use. And within a safe space, this is where such conversations can occur, and it can be curated in a way that doesn't really or minimize the harmful aspects of such conversations.
I think it is.
I think there's general agreement that Singapore should be a place where there is safety, whether physical or psychological, despite sexual orientation. And it is true that socially, in some quarters and in some contexts and situations, there can still be discrimination, there can still be a difficulty for those who experience same-sex attraction, for example, to come out. That is true. But I would say also there's a wider perspective around this which must also be known. I personally experienced same-sex attraction myself, and I have from 7 years old, and I know that. And previously I was in the gay lifestyle for nearly 30 years. And when I started in the gay lifestyle at the beginning of those nearly 30 years, in Singapore, there was a real risk of police raids, on gay bars and gay saunas. So, yeah, there was surely a sense of, higher degree of discrimination or higher degree of risk right? And it was palpable. I knew it because I was in that lifestyle, and it was a matter of being really alert. You know, every time I went to the gay bar, was there a likelihood? You know, was there any risk? You know, of police raid? But I would say that over that time of 30 years of that lifestyle, later on, after 2007, that risk, you know, was non-existent. So there's no fear visiting a gay bar, a gay sauna, that there would be suddenly, you know, a disruption, right? So in some sense, Section 377A, because of the compromise that was reached back in 2007, it removed a lot of that, fear factor.
But we're not talking about, you know, raids. We're talking about the day-to-day mental insecurity.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I agree, but I'm just trying to explain that there are dimensions to this. So to characterize the experience of someone who experiences same-sex attraction as, you know, constantly being under the shadow of fear and phobia and so on, well, it's not entirely true in the sense of what I've just described. However, I'm not denying that there are plenty of experiences still, culturally and socially, where people are fearful of coming out, or if they have come out, they've experienced, you know, rejection and so on. However, I would also make the other point. I mean, Imran said we should be concerned about, you know, tolerance and inclusivity and diversity, and he didn't use those words, but I suppose he was, you know, leaning that way, so that people don't get negatively affected by the things that we say and so on, although different opinions are valid and so on. So I understand the point that he's making, but in some of the cases that I've come across, way before the current debate on the repeal of 377A, there are increasing incidences of those at school or those at workplaces who have a different idea or who have a different opinion or different alternative to you know, LGBT ideas, who are stigmatized, who are silenced, who are also bullied. I know personally a young guy who in his school days was confronted so publicly by somebody who accused him of being a homophobe, which he was not, but he felt so embarrassed in front of such a big group of people that he had to eat lunch on his own for 3 years. He took away food from the canteen and felt that he couldn't face.
Actually, that's a good point. So we do want to talk about how our two very different views can coexist in society. But that's the end. That will be somewhere at the end of the topic. But I would like you to hold that thought because I don't want you to run out of juice. Clement, do you have anything you want to say on this? If not, I'll hand it over to Imran.
Yeah, just very quickly. I think I really empathize with what he just shared about what it was like in his younger days and facing that kind of discrimination. I have friends who have also lived through a similar time. Repeal, I think, cannot be overstated, the amount of relief that they felt. For a lot of them who I spoke with, they didn't think that repeal would happen in their lifetime. And just because we are moving away from that topic, I just want to acknowledge that a lot of work has gone on behind the scenes to make that day happen. And I think we can all agree that none of us in whatever community should ever be made to feel you know, what someone feels, to not be authentically themselves. Yeah.
Imran and Nabila?
Thank you for sharing, Tochen. Yeah, I think there has been cases where people have been called out homophobes easily. Yeah, and I think I agree that those kind of quick labeling should not happen on both sides. But I will share my personal story. I mean, from my perspective, sometimes there are blind spots that I hold. And when someone reacts in a certain manner to what I say, I'm always reflective of maybe that comes from a standpoint of injury. That if you have lived your whole life being told of your unworthiness or being labeled with stereotypes that can be dehumanizing, and if I were to say something that I was not mindful of, that might provoke a reaction that might be something that will take me aback. And I've been called a homophobe simply because I've used certain terms that ought not to be used. And I wasn't aware of how painful those terms are. But I learned through that process, and personally I will hold back and say, maybe there's something else going on around that person's life that I need to understand a bit more. And that's where the process of dialogue actually helps to go beyond just these visceral responses, you know, but to look at how a person who's injured, for example, will always be screaming at you when you touch the wound. And that's how I must be mindful of how I must be more careful with certain things. Because it's not just about me being called out, but it's about me being part of the process together with the whole of society, that we have done something that is making that person react in that way. So that is something that I want to think about personally.
To also just add to your point, I think it's very easy to say there is, team LGBTQ and there is team like anti-LGBTQ, but we don't realize that there are people who may relate to both, for example, like I have a lot of gay friends, people in the LGBTQ community who are also religious, who actively seek religion, and I think sometimes also they don't know how they feel about the issue, because hey, like I identify as gay, but I'm also religious. So how, we can bridge this gap? And I think that is why they face a lot of conflicts about their own identity, and that's why they struggle so hard, especially when it comes to the hostility they face from even people in their community or their support group.
So adding on to Toshin's point, so if someone holds an opinion that may not be so popular, does this mean that they should just keep quiet, or are you not allowed the right to speak and the right to, practice what you believe? Personally, I think that if it does not incite hate, you're well entitled to your own opinions and your own views, because this is how you brought up. This is a culture that you're comfortable with. But should you also then be scared because your opinion is not the popular opinion, it's not the majority opinion?
I don't think anyone should be going around forcing people to change their own views, change who they are. I don't think people should be going around imposing their beliefs on other people and telling people how they should practice their faiths, how they should live their lives. But I think with the freedom that that comes from being able to express your beliefs and practice your beliefs, I don't necessarily think that means freedom from accountability for some of the things that you say. I think we can all agree, as you mentioned, as long as it doesn't incite hatred, right? As long as it doesn't spark violence, as long as it doesn't make conversations that we need to have in society around managing differences toxic. I think we can all agree on that. I mean, there has been a lot of talk around canceling, cancel culture. I think there's enough ink that's been spilled about it. I have a personal view that I think there are some times where you can see a mob go out to cancel. I often, however, feel that a lot of people who talk about it tend to also conflate it with consequence culture. I don't think, for example, that you have the remit to go out and say things that are, factually untrue, that are informed by a particular belief, but you couch it as something else. Or to go out and advocate or campaign very strongly that the government should be doing something that really is going to entrench further discrimination, perpetuate further oppression. I think that's not cancel culture anymore. I think when people call that out and say, I don't think that's acceptable, that's not canceling, that's not bullying, that's not harassment. And I think we need to actually map it back to reality. We need to map it back to when LGBTQ people in Singapore talk about discrimination and oppression that they face. That's what we encounter today. That is not something that could happen tomorrow. I think there's a lot of, if repeal is first, what's next? Will we be forced to hold back on some of the things that we talk about? I've yet to really, I guess, hear a lot of accounts that is sort of the future that we see. Yeah. There's comparisons made to other countries, but I don't think that is the case for Singapore. Lots of things have happened in other countries, and even the movement for repeal and eventually marriage equality happened at a much faster pace. That didn't happen for Singapore, and if it didn't happen there, what gives sort of like that weight and credence to say that the opposite will also happen here as quickly as some people think that it's going to be? There's a lot of fear. I think some of it is also premised on assumptions, biases. I think at some point we just need to tone it down a little bit. Let's look at the facts. Yeah. Let's discuss this calmly and civilly, and I'm pretty sure we'll find a way forward.
I want to build on what you say, actually. This whole issue, I think this will always be contentious, but will we be able to have conversations about it without cancelling one another then? And how do we go about doing that? Because there are always people who hold different opinions from you. It doesn't really have to be on this issue as well. It can be anything. How do we move forward then? What do we do about it? The point on cancelling and
I don't know. This whole discourse on cancelling, I thought has gone out of proportion, in the sense that there is a specific context of what cancelling is really about. For example, it does not provide any space for people to actually learn from their mistakes. It's like it's a mob kind of mentality that actually expands you forever. You know, make sure you lose your job, make sure you disappear from public life. That's what really cancelling is about. But what I'm saying is that it's being used loosely to shield one's own opinion from any kind of criticism, just by simply saying, oh, you are cancelling me. But in reality, it's not happening, because people still have the platforms as well as the resources to say the kind of things that they want to say. But whenever they hear disagreement, then it's, oh, I'm being cancelled. So we really have to look at the specifics of the case and how we must not fall into this trap of looking at any form of criticism against our own ideas as a form of cancelling. It is not, because cancelling is a specific concept in itself, which, yes, we ought not to have it in society, but you can't call every single criticism as cancelling.
Yeah, we got to look at the facts of each case.
Yeah.
But I have come across specific facts of specific cases of real life experiences where cancelling is a reality, and we don't want that, right? Everybody on this panel wants
I think it
to
makes
agree.
the conversation toxic. Yeah.
Yeah, so we don't want that. But I've come across, for example, a student in a school debate team who was excluded by his school coach from his debate team because he had a different view on same-sex marriage. And he was told, unless you change that view, you're not going to be on a school debate team and we're not going to field you. So these things are real. I've come across people in the workplace who, because they hold a different view on whether they are going to take the decal for the Pride Month or whether they're going to take the sticker for the Pride Month, who are then observed and they're made to feel very uncomfortable at work on why they haven't stuck it up. So these things are also just as real and just as toxic and just as traumatizing as other forms of discrimination that we all agree, you know, should not be tolerated and should be, you know, and we should cultivate a culture against, right? So, I mean, I don't disagree either that some people in the LGBTQ community still face discrimination, and we don't want that. I don't want that. I myself experience same-sex attraction, and so it's in my interest also that we don't have discrimination against people just because they experience same-sex attraction. So I'm speaking from experience. But on the same token, I also have encountered incidences where people who hold a different opinion cancel in a very real way. So I'm not talking about this blanket thing about, you know, you can't stop what I'm saying. No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about very real instances, and we also should be cognizant that these things exist. Now, they've not been brought to the fore before, partly because, you know, there's pressure, social pressure, and also partly because there is a sense in the past that, you know, Section 377A is there, and so, look, you know, let's not raise the temperature on this, you know, let's just, because it's there, let's just try and figure a way through this, right? And, but now that Section 377A is on the desk to be repealed, there is now greater urgency, you know, to make sure that these things are addressed in a very proactive way. And I'm very glad that the government is taking this seriously, and they've been not just signaling, but they've actually been active also in indicating that they are not going to tolerate, you know, both ways. And I agree, you know, it should be both ways. The form of either incitement or cancellation that is traumatizing, that's
So I think we're all of the view
discriminatory in
that you
nature.
should be able to hold your own opinion and practice your own opinion without the fear of being cancelled, and you know, you should be able to say what you want. And our audience members have been sending lots of questions. I thank you for that, and I'd like to read them out to you. This one: how do we start conversations about LGBTQ issues with our parents who are very conservative in terms of religion? I think this is something that a lot of young people face.
Yeah.
Opening conversation.
Yeah.
to
Actually,
different generations.
I have spoken to youths who have had this conversation. I mean, who have had to go through this conversation with their parents, and I realize one thing is that when you have this conversation, it needs to be a safe space, right? The setting needs to be right. The you know I would say the mood of that parent and yourself must be also in the right temperature. So actually on this bit, I also wanted to ask Imran, who have, who have done a lot of all this, you have moderated a lot of these conversations. Maybe you can tell us what are some considerations to make it a safe space for people to have this conversation?
Knowing that they're not going to get cancelled the moment they open their mouths.
Well, there are some things that you just simply don't talk to your family about. I mean, it really depends on different family. Different individuals have different family dynamics. So it really depends, and I leave it to your judgment on how much you want to push the envelope and raise some difficult conversations like this. Some children are closer to their parents and they feel that they can communicate certain things with their parents, but some feel that it's not going to happen because things are not going to change. Think of your family WhatsApp group, right? Some random uncle will post something saying, well, do you want to respond to this conspiracy theory or just leave it as it is, right? So there is no really specific answer for this. It really depends on your individual situation. But I do want to note here that sometimes you don't have to start a conversation by diving right into the topic, because it's really tied to a lot of emotions that surrounds this topic. What does your parent think about certain issues? It's got to do also with the context of how they grew up, their social circle, the kind of things that they hear from not just within the family, but from their religious teachers, from the society at large, from what the government is telling, and things like that. What is important, I think, is to recognize where the fear lies and where you can actually address some of these fears without diving right into the topic. Maybe their fear is really about losing their child. If suddenly the child is to say, I'm gay, for example, and they would couch their fear of losing their child in some kind of religious tone, which may seem harsh or may seem hard for the child to accept, but it comes from the standpoint of love sometimes, or the fear of losing the child. So I think it's important to actually build that rapport and try to address the fears first before even jumping into the topic. That will be my first answer to that.
Can I just add on to say that I actually really love what you shared. I think oftentimes, especially for Pink Dot, we do talk to a lot of youth who face a lot of struggles with not only just having these conversations with parents, but actually a lot of them are LGBTQ youth themselves, and they struggle a lot coming out. And this reality check that is actually a very difficult, complicated conversation to have, and that actually multiple individuals in this conversation comes from a different place is actually very powerful. It's actually been on my mind quite a lot after the announcement of repeal, because I think everyone knows that the conversation around marriage as well has always been pitted as LGBTQ versus family values. We are protecting the definition of marriage because we are protecting families. And to me, like what you've shared is so powerful because it actually forces us to realize that it's not a binary. LGBTQ people have families too. We have to have difficult conversations with coming out. We have to reckon with whatever we hear from parents as they react for the first time. And their reaction comes from grief, from fear. It's a very heightened state. And if we use that as kind of like a mirror to society now, I think with emotions, conversations are difficult. But with time, I do think that there is a way we can reach some sort of way forward. We don't know what it looks like now, only because I think we are so clouded. But clarity comes with time. And it also happens with more conversations. So even the first encounter, which can be full of conflict and full of disagreement, I think they melt away as long as we remind ourselves what are the important bonds that we hold dearly.
I just want to add, this is where coming back to being mindful of the kind of language that sometimes we use will have a wider implications at the individual level. Sure, there might be some campaigns out there to say and craft certain things in a certain way, but individuals' response to that will be located within their own experience. I give you an example. If out there is this idea that, okay, let's protect our families, protect our children, right? I've known LGBTQ individuals who is so loving, and he's the only one that is taking care of the child from the parent who's absent, right? How does he feel when these kind of words keep on repeating as though that he is harmful to the existence of children themselves, when he's been the one taking care and lovingly trying to protect the child from harm? So I think when we listen to this kind of stories, then we realize that sometimes what we say outside in public might impact the individual lives, because people's life experiences needs to be understood, needs to be communicated in a way that makes us realize, the wider public, those who are in a privileged position, to see that we are not in that situation, and how we can actually empathize and see that certain words we use can be harmful. And I think the process of dialogue actually brings out this nuance and this lived experience that sometimes we don't hear within the noise of the debates out there.
And to me, that's very transformative, because even though the question originally asked was how can we help children have conversations with their parents on LGBTQ issues, it reminds me that actually parents need help too. I am 32, coming to 33. A lot of my peers growing up in school, they are starting to form their own families. They're starting to have kids. And maybe previously in the past, they didn't think that much about LGBTQ equality. They didn't care that much about it. It didn't really impact them. They had a friend, me, but that's really about it. And now I'm actually they are coming to a realization that if their kids come up to them as gay, as lesbian, as trans, they are actually not well supported. They don't actually know how to deal with this. So I think conversations like that are transformative, because it actually reminds us that there's actually still much more work that needs to be done. And it's only through conversation that we are able to see the whole issue in its complexity and through its multidimensional aspects.
I think this is very healthy in terms of the common ground, you know, in approaching this dialogue, in approaching this topic, which is to promote conversation. And I would also say to promote awareness on both sides, whether it's the kid who's experiencing same-sex attraction, for example, or the parents, you know, who are having to deal with the kid that comes out. Conversation and awareness are very powerful antidotes to misinformation, to misreaction, and also to damage of relationship, right? None of us want that. So actually for a while now, and I don't speak for my church or for the church in general, but for a while now, we've been very active in raising awareness with parents, especially, raising awareness in terms of the realities of this topic, and so that they don't get super shocked, so that they also don't get misinformed by, you know, misperceptions or ideas of the past and so on that are not real, so that they have a better way of coping and dealing with conversations with their children. At the same time, parents have also been increasingly asking for equipping in this area, and I think that's very healthy. Similarly with children, I mean, there are kids who come to us and seek our advice, and we've also been equipping them, raising awareness on both the subject, but also in terms of how to approach the subject with their friends, with society at large, and also with their parents. So there is a lot of merit in caring for both the parents as well as the children, raising awareness at both levels, so that there's a higher level of likelihood that they're going to have a conversation around this as opposed to a confrontation around this. Yeah.
Imran, I have a question for you. It's from our audience member on Instagram. What worked for you and your organization when bringing people together on something as contentious as LGBTQ issues in Singapore?
Sorry, what works?
What worked for you and your organization when bringing people together on something as contentious as LGBTQ rights in Singapore?
Yeah, I think, firstly, I think we've mentioned a lot about safe spaces, right? Safe spaces is where stories can be heard. I think beyond this conceptual discussions, very abstract discussions on some of these aspects, we really have to get down to the real individual lives that are experiencing the discourse in their day-to-day life. And bringing out those experiences are very important within a safe space. A safe space is really more about listening rather than being eager to tell your own stories also. Because sometimes we do get people entering into conversation, they just want to tell their stories. They just want to say, this is how I experience it. But they are not willing to actually listen to what the others have to say deeply and empathically. So in such a conversation, what really works is to actually allow the audience to engage in deep reflections of their own processing experience when they listen to the stories of others. And that requires a bit of courage on their behalf. It requires them to actually see how much the other person's story actually transforms the way they think about the other person. So what works is really this uncovering of your own blind spots, because we are so obsessed with our own life sometimes that we fail to listen that others don't live the kind of life that we live, and they have a different experience, and that's valid too, right? So uncovering our own blind spots also means that we reduce a lot of our stereotypes that we might have of each other. I've had conversations, just to give an example, where one of the participants actually came out in that discussion and said, by the way, I just want to tell everyone that I'm gay. And the response from the other person was, oh, you don't look gay to me. So then this person said, oh, how are gays supposed to look like, right? And that is where the kind of stereotypes get reduced, may not totally disappear, but that person begins to understand the individual has flesh and blood in front of him or her, and not to see through a stereotypical category of being gay or whatever it is, right? Yeah. So I think that those moments are very powerful. But at the same time also, you flesh out the nuances that may not be present in public debates and discourses. Because sometimes it's not just about 377A, whether to repeal or not to repeal. Yep. It's what's the implications of 377A in the individual lives of people who actually have to navigate through some of these laws in place. So when you listen to the stories, it becomes transformative. But what really works is when people are willing to confront their own ignorance, their own blind spots, and allow themselves to be transformed in that process of listening to other people's stories.
I'm getting a lot of good questions from you guys. Don't worry, we see it. I'm going to come to one of them now. How do you think an understanding can be reached between LGBTQ and non-LGBTQ members on each other's beliefs and identity without strife, but with love and acceptance?
It assumes that we haven't reached an understanding, right? I mean, we have an understanding. The understanding is that as all Singaporeans living here, we all have a right to belong. We all have a right to feel included. We want to feel love. We want to feel acceptance, not just from our peers, from our parents, from the people we work with, from our friends. That's an understanding, is it not? And I do believe that maybe if not all the laws say that right now, there is a future and a world in which we can get there. I think that the Constitution, as a secular document that enshrines and encodes these values, are there for a reason. You know, it's powerful. It impacts our lives. Maybe just not all of us are able to experience that just yet in our lived experience. I feel that any conversation, even though it seems like it's contentious at first, I think if we remind ourselves of that common understanding, we will get there. That's not to say, for example, that we will agree on everything. I think in a diverse and plural society like Singapore, differences are bound to crop up. And today we touched on a few things. We touched on toxicity of conversations. We talked about cancel culture. I think that reminds us is that it's not about the fact that we disagree. I think we just need to get over the fact that we will disagree at some point, and that's fine. I think it's about how we disagree. That's really important, and I think Singapore is actually getting better at that. I think Singaporeans are just getting to a point where we can disagree civilly, and I would dare say that the next challenge for us as a country is not just about how we disagree, but what we do after we disagree. Let's take repeal. You said overwhelming, there's a majority of people who think it's the right step. There are some people who disagree with it. What do we do with these people? We're not just going to ignore it. I mean, they have valid concerns. They have strong beliefs that are not going to go away just because repeal has happened and a segment of society are going to move on. That belief is also going to, it's going to underpin a lot more kind of demands or resistance to change. And it's actually our responsibility to address that. Yeah.
It's really a modern problem, I mean, and it's not the first time that we have contentious issues surrounding marriage. 100 years ago, it's really contentious to say that you can choose your own partner. No, your family decides for you. It's arranged marriages, right? It was contentious. In fact, if you look at Malay society, for example, in the early 1900s, there was a struggle to actually reject and go against arranged marriages. You can see in some of the classical writings of that period in time, like Hikayat Faridah Hanum, for example. So societies are evolving. But at the same time also, we do recognize it's a modern problem because it's a problem that's got to do with nation state, right? Take inter-religious relations as an example, and something that I'm very, very familiar with, is that in the past, it's really about two communal groups, for example, vying for domination and influence, right? So if you are Muslim, then you will not allow churches to be built because you have a different set of theology, right? Vice versa, or some other configurations depend on the countries, right? But a nation state ought to accept it from the framework of citizenry, which sees everyone as equal through their national identities, right? They belong to the same country, they are citizens, and therefore the law ought to apply equally. It's no longer about one law of one religious community dominating over another. And that's also the principle of a secular state that Singapore has accepted. And in our civic education, that has been the process of nation building for us, which I mentioned earlier, right? So why can't we apply that same framework now over other contentious issues, right? I may disagree with Toh Chen's Christian ideas, for example, because I'm not Christian, but I will not prevent him from having his own church, right? Or I may think, which I don't, that all Christians go to hell. Just to put a caveat, I don't think that way. I may have the freedom of religious belief to hold on to that idea, and that's guaranteed in Article 15 of the Constitution, but I cannot go out publicly and say Christians will go to hell because that's going to upset the Christian community, it's going to create a lot of conflicts. So I think that is in the interreligious sphere. Now, when we put into the issues like LGBTQ, I think we ought to use the same kind of principles also. I may disagree with homosexuality is permitted in the religious sense, but should I be curtailing some of the rights of the LGBTQ from the framework of our nation state that sees equality of law for all citizens, or the secular state that should not be ruling on one religious values over another, right? And vice versa also. Yeah. So each one have their own spaces. And where we come in the center is to actually dialogue and try to attain more deeper understanding and the civility in our disagreements.
I'm going to hand it to you for the final word. In some sense, there is an idea that there are camps. And also there is an idea that in one camp there are, for example, Christians, you didn't say so, but let's say, Christians who are opposed to certain things and so on. And there's the idea also that if that camp were to then campaign publicly, then they are seen to be imposing their religious values or religious ideas on society. Well, that is not accurate because we are all informed by our different worldviews. And some of those components of worldviews may be religious. Not everything is religious to every single one of us. We have different bits of components to our worldview, some religious, some not religious. But when we express that worldview and we try to persuade others of that worldview, that is an attempt to project our worldview, but it's not imposition, because just as there's been a lot of dialogue around, not shutting people down and so on, just because they're of a different orientation, different perspective, the reciprocal should also apply. Yep. Right? So we should all have a contribution to the nation of Singapore in our worldviews. And we should then dialogue to persuade the nation on the course and direction of its destiny. Right? But just because of one particular view it being expressed doesn't mean that that is an imposition, for example. Of
I fully agree. We'll take this off cam, but I know we have a lot more to say, but we're going to get cut off soon. But that is unfortunately all the time we have today. As promised, I have some prizes to give away. Remember, the first 5 to DM us with your best answer to this question. We'll be in touch with you for that $50 Grab Food voucher. How can we listen to the points of views from different groups without cancelling each other? So how can we listen to the points of views from different groups without cancelling each other? Once again, thank you so much for being a wonderful audience for all the questions. Apologies if we could not get to all of them, but I hope that the conversation did answer some of your questions as well. Thank you guys for being here. We'll take the rest of the conversation off air. And we are just going to tease tomorrow's exciting sessions. We have 2 more sessions tomorrow. That's right. The 3rd session at 2 p.m. tomorrow we'll look at what young, restless workers are chasing after. So that's on careers. And on that panel, I have Jin Lee from Mercury Market and Events, Adrian Chu from Career Agility International, and Jeannie Poon from Teehee SG. And to wrap up our seminar at 3:30 p.m. tomorrow, we'll be talking about the Singapore that youth wants. So this one will be on politics. And joining us for that is Minister of State for Culture, Community and Youth and Trade and Industry, Alvin Tan. I've got Nathaniel Koh. He is Vice President of the Workers' Party Youth Wing, and Chirag Agarwal, he is a former public policy consultant. And I look forward to having you there or for you tuning in on Instagram and TikTok. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
You.